On the 4th of November 1881, a 32-year-old Nevada cattleman named Will Dean stopped at the Eureka Woodyard on his way through town and bought a load of firewood for the schoolteacher, because he had noticed the night before that the schoolhouse stove had been cold. He did not think much about why he did it. The stove had been cold, and he had been passing the woodyard, and he had 50 cents in his coat, and the wood was there. It was the kind of arithmetic that completed itself. The schoolteacher in question was Violet Marsh, 27 years old, wearing her second-best dress on a Tuesday, and writing the morning lesson on a chalkboard with breath that showed in the cold air. She had 12 cents coming at the end of the week. She also, in the lining of her trunk at Nettie Farrow's boarding house, had a land deed worth $40,000 in silver deposits. She had not told a soul. She had been waiting for the title to clear, for the assay to confirm, and though she would not have said this to anyone, to find out what the world thought of her when she had nothing. She had been finding out for 2 years. She turned from the chalkboard when Will appeared in the schoolhouse doorway with the firewood. She looked at him, then at the wood, then at him again. She said, "I didn't ask for it." He said, "I know." He stacked the wood beside the stove and left. She looked at the stove. She looked at the door he had gone out of. She thought, "He knows." He agreed, and he did it anyway. She thought, "That is a specific kind of person." She did not, for some months, know what to do with that. But to understand why Violet Marsh, who could have gone anywhere, was teaching school in Eureka, Nevada on 12 cents a day, while the largest land deed in Lander County was in the lining of her trunk, we have to go back to the morning her father died, and the particular kind of patient she taught herself to be. Arthur Marsh had been a Nevada Territory surveyor for 22 years. He was the kind of man who measured things precisely and recorded them correctly, and he had done this in the service of the Territorial Land Office and in the service of his own claims, which he had filed with the same meticulous attention he brought to his official work. He had 2 claims. The first had come to nothing, low-grade ore, insufficient to develop. The second he had not yet assessed when he died in the autumn of 1878, a high desert claim in the mountains above Lander County, filed in 1877, with an assay pending that he had not lived to receive. He left Violet the deed. He left her nothing else of substance. The house had been rented. The survey instruments were the property of the territory. The small savings were consumed by the funeral and the settlement of his accounts. He left her a trunk of his survey records, his personal library of 15 books, and a water-stained piece of paper with his filing stamp on it, and both their names, his as filer, hers as heir. She had been 24 when he died. She had sat at the table in the rented house after the funeral and looked at the deed and thought, "This is either something or nothing, and I will not know which for some time." She had been right about both. It was something, was, in fact, the largest something she would ever have, and she had not known which for 3 years. In those 3 years, the title dispute from a competing claim filed in 1875, 2 years of legal process, the wait for the assay office to schedule its review, the preliminary notice in 1880 that said the review was still pending, the second notice in March 1882 that said the review was complete. She had managed during those 3 years with the specific resourcefulness of a woman who has learned that resourcefulness is the only capital she can count on. She taught school because she was qualified to do it, and because it was honorable work that did not ask her to be anything other than herself. She lived on the 12 cents a day because it was what there was. She lived quietly and correctly, the way her father had lived, because that was how she was made. She had come to Eureka because the school needed a teacher, and she needed a place to be that was not a place she had been before. She had needed the new place. She had needed to not be the daughter of the dead surveyor in a town that had watched him die. She had needed somewhere she could be just Violet Marsh, of no particular account, while she waited. She had been Violet Marsh, of no particular account, for 2 years. She had been watching what that felt like. What it felt like was small. Not painfully small. She had known this was the experiment and she had chosen it with her eyes open. But small in the way of a room that is the wrong size, where you are always aware of the ceiling. She could feel the ceiling of what Eureka's social order allowed a schoolteacher, and she had been feeling it daily. And she had been noting, carefully, who noticed her within those limits, and who simply used the limits to decide they had seen everything there was to see. Most people had used the limits. Wildine had not. The firewood was the beginning of it, which she understood in retrospect. At the time she had only understood a specific person. She had filed it alongside her notes on the rest of Eureka and continued watching. November gave her more data. He came back the day after the firewood, not with more wood, just to ask if the stove was drawing properly. She said it was. He nodded and went away. He was not lingering. He was not performing attentiveness. He was checking whether the stove was working in the way of a practical man who does a thing and wants to know if it achieved the intended result. She said, "Thank you." For the wood. He said, "It's cold." She said, "Yes." He said, "The stove in that building is underpowered for the elevation." She said, "I know." He said, "I'll look into whether the school board can upgrade it." She said, "That's not your." He said, "I'm on the school board." She had not known this. He left. She stood at the schoolhouse door after he went down the street and thought, he is on the school board, and he brought firewood from the woodyard out of his own pocket before going through the school board for the stove upgrade. He could have just put it on the board agenda. He brought the wood first. She thought, that is the particular shape of a man who does the immediate thing and the systemic thing and considers them different categories. She thought, I would like to know more about how he thinks. December was the month of knowing more about how he thought. He walked with her from the land office on 3 separate occasions, her weekly routine stop. His path home from the feed store or the assay office, coinciding with the kind of frequency that eventually required one of them to acknowledge it was not entirely coincidence. She acknowledged it on the 3rd occasion. She said, "You keep ending up on my route." He said, "It's a short town." She said, "It is." He said, "Is that a problem?" She looked at him. He was looking at her with the same direct attention he brought to everything, which was the attention of a man who asked real questions and expected real answers. She said, "No." He said, "Good." They walked the 2 blocks to the boarding house in the easy near silence of people who have found that the near silence is good. He said at the boarding house steps, "I'll be in town Thursday." Nettie's boarding house serves supper to guests and the public on Thursdays. She said, "I know. I eat there." He said, "Yes." He walked away. She watched him go and thought, he has been at Nettie's on Thursdays. She reviewed the Thursdays and found him in 3 of them. At the far end of the dining room table, eating with the methodical focus of a man doing necessary maintenance on himself. And looking up when she came in. She had noticed the looking up and had not noted it in her careful accounting of Eureka's social texture. She now added it to the accounting. She thought, he has been looking up when I come in. She thought, I have been looking back. She had not noted that either. She went inside and told Nettie she would be at supper Thursday. Nettie said, "I know." At Thursday supper, they sat at the same end of the table, which required no arrangement, and was therefore not an arrangement, just the practical result of both arriving at the same time and the available spaces being adjacent. They ate Nettie's pork roast and talked about the assay office's new location, which was being debated in Eureka with a warmth disproportionate to the stakes. Violet said the location being debated was geologically practical, but commercially inconvenient. Will said he had not considered the geological angle. She said, the formation on the north side of town runs closer to the surface. They'd be saving half the drilling cost by the end of the first year. He thought about this. He said, "You've read the formation reports." She said, "My father was a surveyor. I grew up reading formation reports." He said, "I haven't seen the formation reports." She said, "I can lend them to you." He said, "I'd like that." She brought him the formation reports on Friday. She had them in her trunk, part of her father's survey records, which she had not had occasion to share with anyone in 2 years, and which were the most useful documents she owned for discussing anything involving Nevada land, which was approximately half of all discussions in Eureka. Will read them over the weekend and came back on Monday with 2 questions and a third observation she had not thought of. She answered the questions and considered the observation and said, "You're right about the drainage." He said, "I thought so." She said, "I should have noted that." He said, "You were working from a different set of records, different angle." She thought, "He does not make anything of being right. He simply says he thought so and moves to the next thing." She thought, "I would like to be around someone like that." She thought, "I am already around someone like that. This is what that feels like." January was the month she found the chalk in his coat pocket. She had not found it. He had taken his coat off in the schoolhouse, which he did when the stove was working adequately, which it had been since his school board intervention, and the chalk fell out of the pocket onto the floor. She picked it up. She looked at it. She looked at him. It was her chalk. She recognized it, the specific stub from the schoolhouse tray, the one she had handed him in November as a joke, proof of office. She had said, when he said he was on the school board. She had handed it to him, not expecting him to keep it. She had been making a joke about authority and about his particular way of exercising it, which was practical rather than official. He had kept it. She held the chalk stub and did not say anything for a moment. She thought, "He has been carrying this since November." She said, "You kept it?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He thought for a moment. He said, "I'm not entirely sure." She said, "That's an honest answer." He said, "I try." She gave the chalk back to him. He put it back in his coat pocket without explanation. She went back to the board and continued the afternoon's lesson and thought about a man who was carrying her chalk stub for reasons he could not entirely account for. She thought, that is not nothing. She thought, that is, possibly, a great deal. The chalk was the thing that made her think about telling him. She had been thinking, since she arrived in Eureka, about when and whether she would tell anyone about the deed. She had told no one. She had come to the land office weekly to check on the process, in a town where the land office agent knew her by name, and had never put together that the Marsh in the routine inquiry was the same Marsh in the pending file, because she had a common enough name and he was not a particularly attentive man. She had thought about the moment of telling. She had imagined faces. She had been watching Eureka for 2 years to see how faces changed when something became valuable, and she had seen it happen many times. The assay comes back positive, and a man becomes someone who had previously been nobody, and the faces around him rearrange themselves in the time it takes for the news to travel a block. She had not wanted to be that face rearrangement. She had wanted to find, before the rearrangement, someone whose face would not change. She had not expected to find him in November with firewood. She found him anyway. In February, she took the deed out of the trunk lining and looked at it. She read it the way she always read it, carefully. From the filing stamp to the bottom margin, the language of the territorial land statute, and the specific coordinates in her father's name and hers. She had read it every month for 3 years. The paper was soft at the creases. The water stain on the left margin was exactly where it had always been, the shape of a river on a map, which she had sometimes thought was the most appropriate possible blemish on a piece of paper that was about land. She said, to the empty room, Will. Just his name. Not as a question, not as an address, just the name. The way you say a word when you are testing whether it sounds the way you want it to sound. It sounded right. She thought, I want to tell him. She thought, I want to tell him before the land office tells everyone, because I want to see his face before the rearrangement. I want to see whether there is a rearrangement, or whether his face is the same face it has been since November, when I had nothing. She thought, I think his face will be the same. She thought, I am not yet certain. She put the deed back in the lining and thought, I will be certain by April. At the boarding house breakfast table, 2 weeks before the April notice, Nettie Farrow set the Fuller plate in front of Violet without being asked. She had been doing this since the beginning. The Fuller plate, the better room, the lowest rate in the house. Violet had not asked for any of it, and had not understood why it was given. She said, Nettie, why have you given me the lower rate? Nettie said, without looking up from the coffee she was pouring, because you were waiting for something. Violet said, how did you know? Nettie said, you have the look. People who are waiting for the right thing have a particular look. Patient, certain, like they know the train is coming, and they don't need to check the schedule every 5 minutes because they know it's coming. Violet said, what if the train doesn't come? Nettie said, it always comes. You might be on the wrong platform, but it always comes. She set the coffee down. Yours is coming. I've thought so since November, Violet said. November. Nettie said, when Mr. Dean started ending up at Thursday supper. Violet looked at her. Nettie said, I've been running this house for 20 years. I know when someone starts taking Thursday seriously for the first time. She went back to the kitchen. Violet sat with her Fuller plate and thought. Nettie has known all along that something was being waited for. Not the deed, she couldn't have known about the deed, but the waiting itself. The specific quality of a person who knows something is coming and is prepared to do the work of waiting. She thought, I have been that person. She thought, it is almost time to stop waiting. March brought the preliminary notice. She walked to the land office on a Tuesday afternoon, not her usual day, but the notice had come on a Tuesday and she had been in her room when it arrived. And she had stood in her room with the envelope in her hands for a full minute before opening it. The title dispute was resolved. The assay was confirmed for April review. She went to the land office to confirm the notification was official and not a clerical error, and it was official. The agent said, April 3rd, if the final review confirmed the assay numbers. She walked back to the boarding house. She told Nettie. Nettie said, I know, dear. Violet said, how? Nettie said, you came in through the back. You always come in through the front. Violet thought about that. She had come in through the back because she needed a moment before she was visible. She had not known she was going to do that until she did it. She thought, Nettie reads me better than I thought. She thought, I am going to miss living in this house. She thought, I am not going anywhere. I am going to keep teaching. She thought, The deed does not mean I stop being the person who teaches. She thought. The deed is in a frame on the schoolhouse wall. That is where it belongs. She had not made this decision before she thought it. She had thought it and immediately known it was decided. Will noticed something that week. He came by the schoolhouse on Thursday, before the supper, and said, "You look like you're deciding something." She said, "I'm always deciding something." He said something specific. She said something specific. He said, "How long?" She said, "Possibly 5 weeks." He said, "Then I'll wait." She said, "You don't know what you're waiting for." He said, "No." She said, "That doesn't bother you?" He thought about it. He said, "You have the chalk. Whatever you're waiting on, I think I know what's underneath it." She looked at him. She said, "The chalk." He said, "I've been carrying it since November. I knew why by January. I just wanted to give you the time." She thought, he knew by January. He has been waiting too. Not for the deed, he doesn't know about the deed, but for her to be ready to say what both of them know. She thought, he has been waiting for me to be ready. She thought, I am almost ready. She said, 5 weeks. He said, I'll be here. He was. April 3rd arrived on a clear Nevada morning, the high desert in the first warmth of spring, the basin pale and wide, the mountains going from gray-blue to brown as the season came on. Violet woke early and did not make the morning lesson. She went directly to the land office. Will was on the main street when she came out of the boarding house. He had been in town since the night before for a spring supply run, and he fell into step beside her. She said, I have to go to the land office. He said, I know. She said, you don't know why. He said, no. But you've been waiting for something for 2 years. The land office is where you check every week. He looked at the land office down the street, then at her. It seems like a reasonable guess. She said, I want to show you something. She stopped walking. She opened her coat and took the deed from the inner pocket where she had moved it that morning from the trunk lining, moved it because today it was going to be used, and it belonged in a pocket, not a lining. She unfolded it and held it out. He took it. He read it. She watched his face. She had been watching faces for 2 years. She knew the specific way a face changed when it received new information about value. She knew the tightening around the eyes and the recalibration of the expression, and the way the body reoriented toward the person once the person had become different. His face did not do any of that. He read the deed the way he had read the formation reports, with focused attention, working from the top to the bottom, noting the specific details. He found the assay estimate notation in the margin, her father's handwriting in the cramped surveyor's hand she knew so well. He said, This is your father's claim. She said, Yes. He said, The Arthur Marsh claim pending review. She said, Yes. He said, You've been waiting for the title. She said, 3 years. He held the deed back out to her. His face was the same face it had been in November, in the schoolhouse doorway, with the firewood, the same specific, direct attention. Unchanged, she said. It doesn't. He said, Are we going to the land office? She said, Yes. He said, Then let's go. They went. The land office agent registered the clear deed, ran the assay confirmation, and said the number at full voice, 40,000, conservatively estimated. The 2 men at the back of the office were very still. Violet took the deed back from the counter and looked at it, the water stain, the filing stamp, her father's handwriting, her name below his. She turned to Will. His face was the same. She said, You didn't know? He said, No. She said, You fell for the 12 cents a day school teacher. He said, I fell for you. You happen to be teaching school. She said, The amount is 40,000. He said, I heard him. She said, Does it change anything? He looked at her. He put his hand in his coat pocket and held up the chalk stub, the one she had given him in November as a joke, the one he had been carrying for 5 months. He said, "I was going to ask you something next week. I had it planned for next week because 5 weeks was what you said." He paused. "Is now all right?" She thought about 5 months of firewood and Thursday suppers and formation reports and the chalk in his pocket. She thought about his face not changing when he read the deed. She thought about 2 years of watching what the world thought of her when she had nothing, and finding, at the end of the watching, that she had not been watching the right thing. She had been watching Eureka. She should have been watching him. She said, "Now is all right?" He asked. Her breath caught, not at the question, which she had been ready for since January, but at the realization that she had not needed to wait for April to know the answer to the real question. She had known since November that his face was not going to change. She had simply needed the evidence to be April solid before she trusted herself to believe it. The evidence was April solid. She said yes. Eureka recalibrated over the following 2 weeks. The mining wives were effusive. They said, "We always knew there was something about her," which was not what they had said before April 3rd, but was what they said now, and Violet did not correct them. She had gotten what she needed from the recalibration. She had needed to see it happen, to understand that it did happen, because 2 years of watching had confirmed what she had known at the start. The world's opinion changed based on the deed, and Will Dean's had not. She had found the one face that did not change. She had found it in November, with firewood. She framed the deed and hung it in the schoolhouse. Not in the house. The schoolhouse. Because the schoolhouse was where she had been herself the whole time, and the deed belonged in the place where she had been herself. The deed in the schoolhouse was the whole argument. She had been this person, with this document in her lining, and she had still been worth knowing before anyone knew it. The frame was on the wall to the right of the board, where the morning light from the east window caught it. Below the deed, the morning lessons continued. The 12 children of Eureka continued to learn their letters and their figures and the Nevada territorial statutes, which their teacher could recite from memory. The chalks in the tray were full. Will's horse was at the hitching post below the schoolhouse window at the end of the day, because he had a habit of timing his town errands to the end of the school day, a habit that had started in November and had not ended. He said it was the practical route back from the feed store. She did not point out that the feed store was on the other end of town. They married in June 1882, in the Eureka Church, Nettie Farrow in the first pew, with the expression of a woman who has been expecting exactly this for 6 months, and is glad to see it. Outside the church, in the Nevada summer, the basin was pale and enormous, and the mountains were brown going green in the warm season. Violet thought about her father, who had surveyed this country and had filed a claim in the mountains above it, and had left her a water-stained deed and a particular kind of patience. She thought about the 3 years of waiting, and the 12 cents a day, and the deed in the lining. She thought, "He gave me the best thing he had. Not the deed, the patience. The willingness to let things develop at the rate they develop. The understanding that the right thing, waited for correctly, comes at the right time." She thought, "The patience is the inheritance." She thought, "The deed is nice too." She looked at Will beside her, who was looking at the Nevada mountains in the way of a man who has been looking at them all his life and intends to keep doing it, and she thought, "I found him because I waited. I would have found someone else, perhaps, if I had not waited, but not him. He is specifically the result of the waiting." She thought, "The patience brought me exactly this." She thought, My father was right about that. He was always right about the specific details. She looked at the mountains, which had been there since before her father surveyed them, and would be there after everything she could name. Enormous and indifferent and beautiful. She thought, there is 40,000 in silver in those mountains. She thought, there is also this. She thought, the this is better. She meant both things at once. She was a Nevada surveyor's daughter, and she could hold both things at once. That was what the formation reports were for, to know what was in the ground and to know what was not in the ground, and to value both correctly. She valued both correctly. She thought, my father taught me that. She thought, I am going to keep teaching it. She went back inside for the wedding supper. The chalk was in her pocket. The deed was in the schoolhouse. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Some fortunes are in the ground and some are in the room. Violet Marsh had spent 2 years waiting for the first kind, while living inside the second, and had been wise enough, her father's patience, her own clear eyes, to notice. She had noticed in November. She had simply needed April to be certain. She was certain. She always had been, almost, if this story found you today. Violet's particular patient watching, or Will's face that did not change. Stay with us a little longer. There are more stories here, and every one of them is about someone waiting for the right kind of certain. In January, Violet sat with the formation reports at the boarding house table and thought about her father. She thought about him in the way she thought about him most often, in the field. She had been 12 the last time he took her with him on a survey run. He had not often taken her, but that once she had gone, and she had held the measuring pole in the hard Nevada sun and watched him work. He had explained what he was doing. He always explained. He had a belief, which he had stated several times, that knowledge should be transmitted whenever the opportunity presented itself, because the opportunity would not always present itself again. He said, you hold the pole at the mark, steady, don't compensate for wind. If it moves, let me know, we'll wait for it to steady. She had held the pole very still. He had measured and recorded and moved to the next point. He had done this 12 times in the afternoon, and each time he recorded, he told her what he was recording, and why and what it would mean in the final map. She had understood most of it. She had not understood all of it, but she had understood most of it, and she had asked the questions she did not understand, and he had answered them without simplifying. He did not simplify. He said, you're 12, and you're holding the pole. You should know what the pole is for. She had thought, at 12, that is the right way to talk to someone. She thought about it now, at 27, at the boarding house table with the formation reports, and thought, he gave me the language for all of this. The survey reports, the deed, the land office visits. He gave me the language and the patience to use it correctly. She thought about the deed in the trunk lining, and thought, he also gave me the waiting. He was a man who waited for the right answer and did not accept the wrong one because the waiting was difficult. He had waited 18 months for the secondary claim to assay before he filed the primary one, because he wanted to know what he was dealing with before he put his name on a document. She had been waiting 3 years for the primary claim to clear because she wanted to know what she was dealing with before she put herself on the deed's promise. She thought, we are the same. She thought, I miss him. She thought, I miss him in the specific way of missing someone whose way of being in the world was exactly right and who is gone before you finish learning from it. She thought, he left me the deed and the records and the patience. She thought, I think that was everything he had. She put the formation reports away and went to make the evening lesson plans. She thought about her father while she worked, and she thought about the claim in the mountains above Lander County, and she thought about Will coming to the land office with her on a future April morning, and about his face when he read the deed. She did not know what his face would do. She thought she knew. She was almost certain. The certainty was the thing she was working toward. At the Thursday supper in February, a mining operator named Phelps made a remark about the new school teacher's opinion on the assay office location. A remark that was not unkind, but that was in the register of amusing that she has opinions at all. Phelps said, "What would a school teacher know about our location?" Will said, "Without looking up from his supper, she can recite the territorial land statutes from memory. I'd ask her before assuming what she knows." Phelps said, "The land statutes," Will said, "the full code. Not just the relevant sections, the full code." There was a specific silence. It was the silence of a man who has said a pointed thing without raising his voice, and the room deciding what to do with that. Phelps said, "Well, nothing further." Violet, at the other end of the table, had heard all of it. She looked at her supper plate and thought, "He did not say it for me. He said it because it was accurate and Phelps had said something inaccurate. He corrects inaccuracies. That is the kind of man he is." She thought, "He is the kind of man who corrects inaccuracies, even when the inaccuracy is flattering to him. The inaccuracy that the school teacher does not know things, which makes him seem more substantial by comparison. He corrected it anyway." She thought, "That is, specifically, the kind of man." She looked up from her plate and found him looking back at her with the direct attention that had started in November and had not diminished. She thought, "I am almost certain." She thought, "April is going to make me certain." She was correct. In the week after the April 3rd morning, while Eureka was recalibrating and the mining wives were being effusive, and Phelps had come to Violet to ask about the formation reports in a new and entirely different register than before, something happened that she had not planned. She was at the schoolhouse after the children had gone, sitting at her desk with the afternoon accounts of what the 12 children had accomplished that day. Her particular habit, a daily assessment of where the learning was, when the framed deed caught the late light. She had put it on the wall that morning. She had not had time to look at it properly during the school day. She looked at it now in the late afternoon light, her father's filing stamp, both their names, the water stain in the shape of a river. She thought, "He would have liked this." She thought, "He would have liked that it is in the schoolhouse." She thought, "He would have said," in the practical way he said everything, "that the schoolhouse is the most reasonable place for it, since that is where you have been while you waited, and the waiting should be acknowledged in the place it happened." She thought, "I know what he would have said. I know so well." She thought, "That is its own kind of inheritance." She was still sitting at her desk when Will came by on his way from the feed store. He came to the schoolhouse door and stopped when he saw the deed on the wall. She watched him look at it. He walked to the wall and stood in front of the frame for a moment, reading it, the same way he had read it in her hand on the street that morning, with focused attention, from the top to the bottom. He said, "It belongs here." She said, "I know." He said, "Not the house." She said, "No." He said, "Why not the house?" She said, "Because the schoolhouse is where I was myself the whole time." He was quiet for a moment. He turned from the deed and looked at her at the desk. He said, "That's the right answer." She said, "I know." He said, "Your father would think so." She said, "He would." He was very specific about things being in the right place. He said, "What was he like?" She thought about it. She said, "Precise, honest." He explained everything. He believed knowledge should be transmitted whenever the opportunity presented itself. because the opportunity would not always present itself again. Will said, "He sounds like someone who knew what things were worth." She said, "He did. He just didn't always get to find out in time." Will said, "The deed." She said, "He filed it, and the assay was pending when he died. He knew what he had, but he didn't get to see it confirmed." Will said, "He knew what he had." She said, "Yes." He said, "Like you did." She looked at him. She thought, he means the deed. He is talking about the deed, about knowing what the claim was worth before the assay confirmed it. She thought, he might also mean something else. She said, "He taught me that. Knowing what you have before the confirmation." He said, "Good teacher." She said, "The best I had." He looked at the deed one more time. He said, "The morning light will hit it from the east window." She said, "Yes, I planned for that." He said, "He would have planned for that too, wouldn't he?" She said, "He surveyed by morning light. Said it was the most accurate." Will said, "Sounds about right." He went to the door, put on his coat, and found the chalk stub in the pocket. He looked at it in his hand for a moment. She said, "You can keep it." He said, "I was going to." She said, "I know." He put it back in his pocket and went home. She sat at her desk in the schoolhouse with her father's deed on the wall in the late light and thought about the right things being in the right places. The deed on the schoolhouse wall, the chalk in Will's pocket, the fuller plate at Nettie's table, the firewood by the stove, everything in the right place. Everything, including her. She had been in the right place since November. She had simply been waiting for the rest to catch up. It had caught up. She thought, that is what patience is. Not endurance, not suffering through. Patience is knowing the right thing is coming and being in the right place to receive it when it does. She thought, my father was right about that too. She thought, he was right about most things. She picked up the afternoon accounts and finished them. The accounts were in order. The 12 children had done well today. 3 of them were reading at the level above their expected grade. One of them had drawn a small horse in the margin of his reading lesson, which she had not corrected because the horse was well drawn and the reading was also correct. She thought, this is the right work. She thought, I am going to keep doing it. She thought, the deed on the wall changes nothing about the work. She thought, that is the most important thing I have learned in 2 years. She closed the accounts and picked up the chalk from the tray, a full stick, sharp at the end, ready for the morning lesson. She put it in her pocket alongside the afternoon certainty. She went home. The Nevada evening was wide and cold and particular. The high desert sky going deep blue at the edges, the mountains where the silver was catching the last of the sun. Her father had surveyed those mountains. She was going to keep teaching in their shadow. Both things were true at once. She was made for both things. She had always been. In the months between November and April, the schoolhouse stove became a conversation. Not the stove itself. The stove was replaced by school board order in December, an upgrade to a larger model that actually heated the room to a temperature suitable for children to remove their coats. This was Will's doing, efficient and undramatic. He had put the motion to the board. The board had voted. The stove had been replaced. Violet had come to school on the December Monday and found the new stove, and had said nothing about it in public, because saying something about it publicly would have made it something it was not. She had said something to Will privately. She had said, "Thank you for the stove." He had said the old one was undersized. She had said, "I know." "I've been cold for 2 years." He had said, "I know." She had said, "How long have you known?" He had said, "Since November." She had said, before the firewood. He had said, I noticed the stove the week before. The firewood was easier to manage than the board process. She had thought, he noticed a week before he did anything. He watched for a week and then brought the wood himself and then went through the board for the replacement. He did the immediate thing and the systemic thing in the correct order. She had said, that's very practical. He had said, it was obvious. She had said, most people don't do obvious things. He had said, I know. She thought about obvious things for the rest of December. She thought about what it meant to do the obvious thing, to see the cold stove and bring the wood, to see the underpowered stove and upgrade it through the board, to see a school teacher being dismissed and say quietly that she could recite the land statutes. The obvious thing, done without deliberation, because deliberation would mean waiting for it to be easy, and the obvious thing was not always easy. She thought, Will does the obvious thing and considers it unremarkable. She thought, that is the quality I have been watching for. She thought, I am watching it. In February, she wrote to the land office agent in Carson City, not the Eureka agent, who did not know the Marsh file from any other file, but the Carson City agent, who had the senior file, and who would have the final confirmation when it came. She wrote a professional letter, formal and specific, asking for a timeline on the Marsh claim review. She had been writing this letter annually for 3 years, and the tone had not changed. She wrote it the way her father had written his claim correspondence, precisely, without impatience, as a statement of ongoing interest rather than an expression of need. She received a reply in March that was different from the previous replies. Previous replies had said, the review is pending, anticipated by the following date. The March reply said, the review is complete, the title is clear, the assay is confirmed. Please present the deed at the Eureka Land Office for registration on or after April 3rd. She read the reply 4 times. Then she went to Nettie's kitchen and stood in the doorway and said, it's April 3rd. Nettie was at the stove. She did not turn around. She said, I'll have the good brandy out. Violet said, you knew? Nettie said, I knew it was coming. I didn't know when. Violet said, how did you know it was coming? Nettie said, the trunk. Violet said, what about the trunk? Nettie said, when a woman moves into a room and the first thing she does is check the security of the trunk lining, I know there's something in the trunk lining. Violet stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. She said, you never asked. Nettie said, I don't ask about trunk linings. That's a rule I have. She turned around. She had the expression of a woman who has been managing her knowledge with discipline for 2 years and is glad to be able to let it out. She said, is it good? Violet said, very good. Nettie said, good. She turned back to the stove. Tell Mr. Dean before it's public. Violet said, I'm planning to. Nettie said, good. He should hear it from you. She did. On the morning of April 3rd, she showed him the deed on the street before they reached the land office. She had been deciding since February whether to tell him before or at the office, and she had decided before. She wanted him to have his reaction before there were other people watching. She wanted to see his face without the context of the land office and the agent and the other men. She showed him on the street. His face did not change. She thought, I knew. She thought, I was right. She thought, I have been watching faces for 2 years and I could see this one from November. She thought, but I needed April to be certain. She thought, April confirmed it. She thought, the confirmation is worth having even when you already know. Her father had said that about assays. The assay confirms what the formation suggests. You do the assay not because you doubt the formation, but because the confirmation has its own value. It is the thing that makes the knowing official, and the official knowing is the thing that lets you act on it. She had done the assay in April. The assay was what she expected. She acted on it. The summer of 1882 was the best summer Violet Marsh had had in 4 years. She was teaching. She was planning the fall curriculum and ordering the new reading primers and having the schoolhouse windows properly caulked before the winter, which was a school board expense that Will had also managed, because he had the habit of noticing the obvious needs of the institution. She was learning the cattle business, sideways from proximity, from the conversations over supper and over the accounting books, and from the long rides to the summer range that she had started taking on Saturdays, because the summer range above Eureka was as beautiful as anything she had seen, and because Will had said, once, in passing, the view from the North Ridge is worth the ride. If you want to see it. She had wanted to see it. She saw it. She stood on the North Ridge in the June sun and looked at the Nevada basin spread below, the pale, wide, high desert going every direction, the mountains around the edges, Eureka invisible at this distance but present, smoke from the assay office and the mining operations a gray haze at the edge of vision, and thought about her father surveying this country. He had been on this ridge. She knew it from the survey records. His handwriting in the cramped notation, NR, elevation, bearings, date. He had stood where she was standing and measured what he could see. She thought, he saw this. She thought, he left me this. She thought, he left me the deed and the records and the patience and all of this, and I am standing on his ridge looking at his country, and it is mine now. And I am here with the right person. Will was beside her, looking at the same view with the easy proprietary affection of a man who has looked at it many times and is still glad to look. He said, "Worth the ride?" She said yes. He said, "Your father surveyed up here." She said, "I know. I read the records." He said, "I knew a man who remembered him, old surveyor in the valley. Said Arthur Marsh could read a formation in half the time it took anyone else." She said, "That was him." He said, "He taught you." She said, "Everything he could." He looked at the view for a moment. He said, "Then we have him to thank." She said, "For the claim?" He said, "For you." She thought about that. She thought about 12 years old in the Nevada sun, holding the measuring pole steady. She thought about, you hold the pole at the mark, don't compensate for wind. She thought about the specific texture of patience being transmitted. She said, "He would have liked you." Will said, "I hope so." She said, "He appreciated people who did the obvious thing without making a production of it." Will said, "The firewood." She said, "The firewood, and the stove, and the land statutes at the February supper." She paused. "And the chalk." He looked at her. He said, "What about the chalk?" She said, "You carried it for 5 months." He said, "That's not." She said, "That's exactly the obvious thing. I handed it to you as a joke and you kept it because keeping it was the right thing to do. And you didn't make a production of it, and it was in your pocket when it mattered." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "It was obvious." She said, "I know." They rode back down the ridge in the June afternoon, the Nevada summer enormous around them, her father's claim behind them in the mountains. The silver in the ground that it had been waiting as long as she had. Everything had been waiting in the right place. Everything had been ready. The only thing needed was the time. She thought, the patience is the inheritance. She thought, I used it correctly. She thought, my father would be satisfied. She thought, so am I. On the first morning of the fall school term, Violet stood at the schoolhouse board with fresh chalk and wrote the day's lesson. The morning light was through the east windows. The 12 children, 13 now, with a new family in from Elko, were settling into their desks. The new stove was working correctly. The deed on the wall to the right of the board caught the light from the east window in the way she had planned. She thought, "This is the right room." She thought, "This is the right work." She thought, "The deed is on the wall, and the chalk is in the tray, and Will's horse will be at the hitching post at the end of the day." She thought, "Everything is in the right place." She turned to the board. "Good morning," she said to the 13 children. "We are going to start today with the Nevada Territorial Land Statutes, which are not in your primer, but which you will need to know, because you live in Nevada, and this is what Nevada is built on." A boy in the second row raised his hand. He said, "Is that on the wall?" She said, "Yes. That is a land deed. It belonged to my father. He surveyed this county." The boy looked at the deed. He said, "Are you rich?" Violet said, "I have enough. Turn to page 1. She picked up the chalk. The lesson began. The deed caught the morning light. Her father's handwriting was in the corner, cramped and meticulous and permanent. Everything was exactly right. She had waited for exactly this. It was worth it. It always had been. One evening in October, 3 months into the marriage, Will asked Violet something she had been expecting him to ask, and that he had, for reasons she had not yet determined, not asked before. He asked, "When did you know?" "About me." They were at the kitchen table, the fall accounts between them, the cattle accounts and the school accounts, which they managed side by side, 2 ledgers at one table, which was how most of their evenings worked. She set her pen down. She said, "November." He said, "The firewood." She said, "Before the firewood. The morning before. I saw you on the street and you were looking at the schoolhouse, and I thought, that is a man who is deciding whether to do something." He said, "I was." She said, "You did it." He said, "Yes." She said, "And then you came back the next day to ask if the stove was drawing properly." He said, "It needed to work." She said, "I know." She picked up her pen and turned it in her fingers. That was the thing. You did the thing and then you checked whether the thing worked. You're interested in whether what you do actually achieves the intended result. Most people do the thing and consider it done. He said, "The thing isn't done until it works." She said, "Yes, exactly, that was when I knew." He said, "The second day." She said, "The second day." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "And then you spent 5 months making sure." She said, "I had been waiting for 3 years for an assay to confirm something I already knew was in the ground. 5 months is nothing." He said, "Fair enough." She said, "When did you know?" "About me." He thought about it. He said, "The first day." She said, "The firewood." He said, "Before. I saw you through the schoolhouse window on a Thursday morning writing the lesson. The room was cold and your breath was showing, and you were writing the lesson in your regular hand, not hurrying, not," she said, "not reacting to the cold." He said, "Yes." She said, "I was reacting to the cold." Inside, he said, "I know. But you were writing the lesson anyway." She said, "The lesson was due." He said, "Yes." He picked up his pen and looked at it. That was the obvious thing to notice. A woman who writes the lesson when the room is cold because the lesson is due. I noticed it and I thought, that's a specific kind of person. She said, "And then you brought the firewood." He said, "And then I brought the firewood." She thought, he saw me through the window on a Thursday morning in November, and he brought the firewood the next day, and he has been in my life since without a break. She thought, That is the speed of someone who does the obvious thing. She thought, I am glad he does the obvious thing at speed. She picked up her pen and went back to the school accounts. He went back to the cattle accounts. The evening continued in the good quiet of two people working in the same room, at the same table on the same broad enterprise. Outside, the Nevada fall was proceeding, the high desert cooling toward winter, the mountains going dark, the sky enormous and particular in the way it was this time of year. She thought, this is the view. She thought, this is what I was waiting for. She thought, not the deed, not the 40,000. This, she thought, the deed is on the schoolhouse wall. She thought, this is the table. She worked. He worked. The accounts were correct, both ledgers, all the way through.